When you take your car to the mechanic, because it's sluggish, you generally expect a pretty simple answer.
Right, like it's a clogged filter or something.
Exactly, it's a clogged filter or maybe a bad spark plug. You pay the fee, you fix the single broken part, the engine roars back to life, and you are flying down the highway again.
Yeah, that's the ideal scenario.
But what if the mechanic looks at you and says, well, your fuel lines are shrinking, the type of gas we are forced to use is suddenly way more expensive, and, half the engine's moving parts just decided to permanently retire?
I mean, that is a vehicle that's going to cost an absolute fortune to drive.
Yeah.
And honestly, you are going to be stuck driving it very, very slowly for a really long time.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking our sources and answering one massive question for you. Are Western economies locked into a 10-year era of stagflation?
It's a big question.
It really is. We are looking at a set of economic discussions and research notes focusing specifically on Western capitalist economies, so places like the US, the UK, and Canada. And the general consensus here is that the structural rules of the game have shifted fundamentally from what we experienced in the 2010s.
Yeah, we are basically transitioning from an era of abundance and hyper efficiency into an era of friction and scarcity. And that transition is what is keeping macroeconomists awake at night right now.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the terminology itself, because we all know stagflation is that nasty mix of high prices and stagnant growth.
Right, low growth, high inflation.
But our sources point out that this upcoming era isn't just a replay of the 1970s and 1980s. The DNA of this stagflation is entirely different because, people hear stagflation and they immediately picture gas lines and double-digit interest rates. How does this new version actually compare?
Well, the symptoms look identical on paper, right? Inflation runs hot while GDP growth just flatlines. But the underlying pathology is completely distinct.
Distinct how?
So the stagflation of the late 70s and 80s was largely the result of massive, sudden external shocks, primarily the Arab oil embargoes.
Oh, right. Energy prices quadrupled almost overnight.
Exactly. It was a singular external blow to the system.
A clogged filter, to use our mechanic analogy from earlier. You fix the supply shock, you adjust interest rates, and eventually the engine recovers.
Precisely. But the threat detailed in our sources for the next decade isn't a single external shock. It is driven by a complex, three-headed monster of deep internal structural changes.
3 heads, okay?
Yeah. These are slow-moving tectonic plates that are shifting underneath the global economy. They're baked into the system, which makes them incredibly difficult for central banks to just fix with simple interest rate adjustments.
So let's look at the first head of this monster because it deals with the actual humans powering these economies. We're talking about the demographic time bomb, right?
Yes. The massive wave of post-war baby boomers who are now permanently leaving the workforce.
Right. And to make this relatable, imagine a busy restaurant where the dining room is totally full, but half the kitchen staff just retired.
That's a great way to put it.
The total population of people needing to eat is the exact same, but the labor pool to actually feed them has shrunk.
And what's fascinating here is the mechanics of why this matters so much. It's not just a matter of having fewer people in the office. It's about a macroeconomic concept called the dependency ratio.
The dependency ratio. Okay, break that down for us.
Sure. So for decades, Western economies benefited from a massive bulge of prime-age workers. We had a huge number of people producing goods and services and a relatively small number of retirees consuming them.
So the denominator of active workers was huge.
Exactly. But now that equation is flipping. We have a stable or even growing total population that still needs to consume things. They still need housing, they still need groceries, and crucially, as they age, they need heavily labor-intensive services like healthcare.
Which requires humans.
Right. That's the critical mechanism. The demand for labor-intensive services is actually going up, while the absolute number of human beings available to provide those services is shrinking. It creates a long-term structural absolute shortage of labor.
Wait, hold on, though. We constantly hear about how a tight labor market is like a massive win for everyday people.
Oh, sure.
Workers have more leverage, they can demand better pay, better benefits. Isn't rising wages exactly what we want for a healthy middle class? Like, why is this a driver of stagflation?
Well, on an individual microeconomic level, higher wages are absolutely a good thing for that specific worker.
Right.
But we have to zoom out to the macroeconomic level and look at aggregate productivity. When a hospital is desperate for nurses, or say a construction firm is desperate for builders, they have to aggressively bid up wages to poach workers from other companies.
Because the actual pool of workers isn't growing. They're just fighting over a shrinking pie.
Yes, precisely. And when businesses pay significantly more money for the exact same amount of output, or sometimes even less output, because they're forced to hire maybe less experienced workers to fill the gaps, that dynamic acts as a permanent engine pushing inflation higher.
Because the costs have to go somewhere.
Exactly. If a business's labor costs go up 10%, but their output stays flat, they really have no choice but to pass that 10% cost directly onto the consumer.
So that's wage push inflation. Going back to the restaurant, the owner has to pay the remaining cooks double to stay. So they double the price of the burger on the menu.
Yep.
The worker gets a raise, but their new salary buys the exact same standard of living because everything around them got more expensive to produce.
And that is the insidious nature of structural labor shortages.
Yeah.
You get the inflation, but without the actual economic growth. It is a massive drag on the system's overall momentum.
Wow. Okay, so domestic labor is shrinking and getting way more expensive. Now, historically, the pressure release valve for that exact problem was globalization, right?
Yes, absolutely.
If building something in Ohio or Manchester got too expensive, corporations just offshored the work to countries with massive, inexpensive labor pools.
Right, but we're suddenly slamming that valve shut.
Exactly. Our sources point heavily to decoupling and the fragmentation of global trade as the second major driver of this new stagflation.
Because the paradigm of the last 40 years was hyper-globalization. Supply chains were optimized for one thing and one thing only, and that was absolute economic efficiency.
But the narrative has totally flipped over the last 3 years. I mean, bringing manufacturing back home, reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, it's pitched as the ultimate fix for our fragile supply chains.
It is.
Because we all saw what happened during the pandemic when global shipping just froze. So wait, you're telling me this geopolitical fix is actually a driver of stagflation?
It is a profound trade-off. While bringing supply chains closer to home absolutely reduces reliance on a single, potentially adversarial nation, which, to be clear, provides undeniable political and national security benefits, economically speaking, it introduces massive friction into a system that used to be virtually frictionless.
Walk us through that friction. How does moving a factory actually drive a decade of inflation for everyday people?
Let's look at how a modern supply chain actually works in reality. Take a single microchip used in a modern car. Before that chip is finally installed into the dashboard, its components might have crossed 70 different international borders.
70. Wait, seriously?
Yes, 70. The raw silicon is mined in one country, refined in another, printed in a third, packaged in a fourth, and tested in a fifth.
And that's because each of those specific countries spent decades building highly specialized, incredibly efficient infrastructure just for that one tiny step of the process.
Exactly the point. Now imagine a government steps in and says, for national security reasons, you can no longer use that 70-border supply chain. You must build the entire chip domestically.
Okay, that sounds incredibly expensive.
It is. You aren't just paying the higher wages of the domestic workers. You have to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to entirely recreate a deeply complex supplier ecosystem that took half a century to build organically somewhere else.
And the sources refer to this as a suboptimal reallocation of resources. You are forcing capital to build redundant factories instead of inventing new technologies.
Furthermore, when we fragment the global economy into geopolitical blocks, we see a massive spike in tariffs.
Right.
A tariff is simply a tax on friction. If a piece of electronics crosses 5 borders in a fragmented world, and each border slaps a 5% tariff on it to protect their domestic industries, that cost compounds at every single step.
And obviously the importing company doesn't absorb that cost out of the goodness of their hearts.
No, never.
They pass it directly down to the consumer. So you, listening to this right now, you end up paying significantly more for a car or a phone that is fundamentally no better than the one you bought 5 years ago.
That is the core of the second stagflation driver. Deglobalization restricts knowledge sharing across borders. It demands massive upfront capital to build redundant supply chains, and it relies on tariffs that artificially inflate prices. Global economic growth potential is inherently capped because the whole system is running with the parking brake engaged.
Okay, so we are forcibly reallocating our global manufacturing supply chains for security reasons. But that brings us to the third structural force, which honestly might be the most daunting.
Yeah, the third head of the monster.
Right, because we aren't just rebuilding where we make things.
Yeah.
We are fundamentally reallocating how we power the entire planet.
The green energy transition, and this is an unavoidable physical reality.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This transition has spawned two new terms in the economic lexicon that our sources focus heavily on: greenflation and climateflation. Let's look at the mechanics of this. We all understand the environmental imperative to move away from fossil fuels, but why does going green carry such a massive structural macroeconomic cost?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to realize that transitioning to a low-carbon economy is not a software update. It is arguably the largest physical Earth-moving project in human history.
Oh, wow.
To replace the global energy infrastructure, we have to manufacture and deploy millions of solar panels, wind turbines, high-capacity grid batteries, and electric vehicles.
And you can't build a wind turbine out of good intentions. They require staggering amounts of specific physical materials. The source has heavily emphasized critical minerals like copper, lithium, nickel, cobalt, and rare earth elements.
The sheer volume of material required is really difficult to overstate. An electric vehicle, for example, requires roughly 2.5 times as much copper as a traditional internal combustion engine car.
2.5 times.
Yeah. And it requires massive amounts of lithium for the battery pack. As every major economy on Earth simultaneously attempts to hit net zero emissions targets by 2050, the global demand for these critical minerals is skyrocketing in a way the mining industry has never seen before.
Which brings us to a massive bottleneck: the paradox of greenflation. We need all these minerals to save the global environment. But to get them, we have to physically dig them out of the ground.
Yeah.
And the environmental regulations designed to protect local ecosystems make extracting these minerals painfully slow and incredibly expensive.
It is a profound structural paradox. In many Western countries, the permitting process to open a new copper mine or a lithium processing facility can take anywhere from 10 to 15 years.
10 to 15 years just for the permit.
Just for the permit. You have to clear environmental impact studies, secure water rights, and navigate deeply complex local zoning laws.
So we have governments mandating the rapid adoption of electric vehicles by 2035, which creates an artificial demand shock for copper, while simultaneously making it legally and procedurally exhausting to increase the supply of that exact same copper.
And when skyrocketing, mandated demand crashes into a legally constrained, rigid supply, there is only one possible outcome: continuous, long-term upward pressure on raw material prices.
Right.
The cost of the green transition gets baked into the price of energy, transportation, and literally every single product that moves on a truck or a train. It is a permanent inflationary floor.
Okay, let's take a breath and synthesize what we've unpacked so far, because it paints a very specific picture of the 2020s and 2030s.
It does.
We have an aging, shrinking active labor pool pushing wages up while capping output. We have geopolitical decoupling and the unwinding of hyperglobalization pushing manufacturing costs up.
Yeah.
And we have the sheer physical reality of the green energy transition pushing raw material and energy costs up.
Yes.
All three of these forces are simultaneously pushing inflation up while dragging economic growth down.
Which brings us to the verdict drawn from the World Bank analysis highlighted in our sources. When they run the models on these three compounding structural forces, global growth expectations for the next decade drop significantly below the average we experienced over the past 20 years.
And the specific term they use is a stagflation-lite environment.
Yes. It implies a light to moderate stagflation. As we discussed earlier, we might not see the catastrophic, volatile 14% inflation spikes of the 1980s.
So no gas lines.
Probably no gas lines. Instead, it is a slow, persistent bleed. It's a decade where inflation hovers stubbornly at, say, 3 or 4%, interest rates have to stay elevated to fight it, and the broader economy just struggles to gain any real momentum.
So practically speaking, your money simply doesn't go as far year after year, which obviously makes long-term planning and saving for retirement a completely different game than it was a decade ago.
Absolutely.
That is a deeply sobering baseline. If the structural anchors of demographics, decoupling, and greenflation are so heavily baked into the math of the global economy, it begs the question, are we just trapped? Like, is there any variable big enough to break this low-growth, high-inflation cycle, or do we just have to accept a lost decade?
Well, there is one major variable, a single massive wildcard that could theoretically shatter this structural pattern, and it's the widespread, rapid adoption of artificial intelligence and advanced automation.
Ah, AI. It feels like every deep dive eventually leads back to AI. But we need to look at the specific mechanisms here. How does a large language model or a new generation of industrial robotics actually fix a geopolitical supply chain fracture or, a copper mine permitting delay?
It all comes down to a crucial economic metric called total factor productivity, or TFP.
Okay, let's break TFP down because it sounds like the magic bullet in these economic notes. How does it actually work?
So, total factor productivity is essentially the measure of human ingenuity. It's the ultimate efficiency metric of an economy. Economic growth traditionally comes from adding more inputs, right? You add more workers to the factory or you buy more machines. But TFP measures the growth that happens when you don't add any new inputs, but you figure out a smarter, more innovative way to combine the ones you already have.
What's fascinating here is how TFP acts as the ultimate deflationary force.
Yeah.
If you can produce twice as many goods with the exact same amount of labor and raw materials,
hmm
the cost of those goods plummets.
Exactly the mechanism.
Hmm.
So if things stay exactly as they are right now, if our technological capability just plateaus, the pessimistic outlook from our sources is absolutely a decade of stagflation-light.
The costs of aging populations and green energy will simply overwhelm the system.
Yes. But the optimistic outlook relies on AI triggering an explosive burst of total factor productivity by the early 2030s.
So think about the mechanisms of those three headwinds we discussed and how AI directly attacks them. Let's take the labor shortage. If a logistics company can't find enough truck drivers or warehouse workers, they don't just shrink their business, right? They implement AI-driven predictive logistics and autonomous sorting.
Exactly. The AI optimizes the routing so perfectly that they can move 20% more freight while burning 15% less fuel using the exact same number of human workers.
They're literally bridging the demographic gap with silicon instead of human labor. But what about the greenflation bottleneck? I mean, can an AI dig a copper mine faster?
It might not physically dig the mine, but it can accelerate materials science.
Oh, true.
We are already seeing AI models analyzing millions of molecular structures in days of process that used to take human chemists decades to discover synthetic alternatives to rare earth metals.
Wow.
If AI helps us invent a new type of solid-state battery that doesn't even require lithium or cobalt, the entire greenflation bottleneck vanishes almost overnight.
That's incredible. And for decoupling, AI can map and optimize those fragmented, redundant supply chains to strip out the friction that tariffs and borders introduce. So it really is a race. We are watching a high-stakes race between the heavy structural anchors of demographics, deglobalization, and green energy pulling us down into the mud, and the rocket engine of AI productivity trying to pull us out.
That is exactly the dynamic defining the next 10 years. If the productivity burst from AI is strong enough, broad enough, and happens fast enough, it could entirely offset the massive costs of the shrinking labor force and supply chain decoupling.
So it could pull the global economy back onto a track of high growth and low inflation.
Yeah, completely neutralizing the stagflation-light scenario.
We really are at a fascinating pivot point in macroeconomic history. To wrap up our deep dive today, I want to bring this all back to you, the listener. We've covered a tremendous amount of ground here,
We really have.
from the sheer math of the dependency ratio as boomers retire, to the hidden compounding costs of pulling back from global trade, to the paradox of environmental regulations making the green transition incredibly expensive. These are the three massive forces setting the stage for this stagflation-like decade.
And the critical takeaway is that these forces are not isolated. They are happening simultaneously, compounding each other's effects.
But understanding these macro trends, really getting the why and the how behind them, is the ultimate shortcut to being well-informed. It explains why the prices you see at the grocery store or the car dealership are so stubborn.
Yeah.
It explains why the global economy just feels so fundamentally different now compared to the frictionless growth of the 2010s. It's not just a temporary glitch. The structural rules of the game have shifted.
And this raises one final, I think, very provocative question for you to mull over as you go about your day. We talked about AI being the great escape hatch from this economic gravity, but what if it is the only major escape hatch from a decade of stagflation?
If that's true, the stakes for adoption are totally existential.
Precisely. If the explosive productivity of artificial intelligence is the only way out, what happens to the countries, the industries, or even the individual workers who fail to adopt it in time? Are we looking at a future where the gap between the AI-powered who escape stagflation and the left behind who are forced to absorb all of its brutal costs becomes the ultimate global divide?
An economic divide based entirely on who adopts the new recipe for productivity while the old recipe stops working. That is a thought that will definitely stick with you. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. Keep questioning the forces shaping our world, keep looking for the why behind the headlines, and we will catch you next time.